Welcome to the Sleep Detective, where history's greatest mysteries unfold like gentle dreams in the quiet hours of night. I'm here to guide you through stories that have puzzled minds for generations, told in the softest way possible, designed to help you drift into peaceful sleep while your curious mind wanders through the corridors of time. Tonight, we journey back to Victorian London in the autumn of 1888 to the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel, where gas lamps cast dancing shadows and the Thames whispers its ancient secrets. But this isn't a story of fear or horror. Instead, it's a gentle exploration of a young woman named Mary Kelly, whose life became entangled with one of history's most enduring mysteries. Mary Kelly was 25 years old that November, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and a voice that carried traces of her Welsh childhood. She lived in a small room at 13 Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street, in a neighborhood where survival required both strength and kindness. While the world would remember her as the final victim of Jack the Ripper tonight, well, remember her as she truly was a person, with hopes, fears, friendships, and dreams that extended far beyond the tragedy that would overshadow her story. The autumn of 1888 was particularly beautiful in London, with golden leaves carpeting the streets and a crispness in the air that made people pull their coats a little closer. The city was changing rapidly, with new technologies and ideas reshaping daily life, yet, in the narrow streets of Whitechapel, time seemed to move more slowly. Here, neighbors knew each other's voices, shopkeepers remembered their customers' preferences, and small acts of kindness helped people navigate the challenges of urban life. As we settle into Mary's story, let yourself sink deeper into comfort. Feel the weight of your blankets, the softness of your pillow, and allow your breathing to slow and deepen. We're not here to solve a crime or chase shadows through dark alleys. Instead, we're here to understand a moment in time, to explore the gentle mystery of how an ordinary young woman spent her final days, and to honor the complexity of her life beyond the headlines that would follow. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and let the fog of Victorian London wrap around you like a soft, protective blanket. Let yourself drift back through time, where every breath you take carries you deeper into this peaceful exploration of mystery, memory, and the quiet dignity of everyday life in a world that feels both distant and surprisingly familiar. Chapter 1. The Autumn Fog. The fog arrived that November morning, like a familiar friend rolling up from the Thames with the slow patience of something that had learned to take its time. It wasn't the thick, choking fog that would sometimes blanket London for days, making it impossible to see your own hand in front of your face. This was gentler, more like a soft, gray shawl draped over the city's shoulders, muffling the harsh edges of cobblestone and brick, softening the calls of street vendors and the clip-clop of horses' hooves on wet pavement. Mary Kelly had always found something comforting about the fog. Perhaps it reminded her of the mists that would roll across the Welsh valleys of her childhood, or maybe it was simply the way it created a sense of intimacy in the vast sprawl of London. When the fog settled over Whitechapel, the neighborhood felt smaller, more like a village where everyone moved with deliberate care, their voices carrying differently in the thick air. She stood at her small window that morning, watching the world transform outside. The gaslight from the street lamp below created a soft golden orb in the gray, and she could hear Mrs. Harvey from next door humming as she prepared her morning tea. The sound drifted through the thin walls with a gentle familiarity that spoke of months of shared mornings, shared silences, and the unspoken understanding that develops between neighbors who live close enough to hear each other breathe. The autumn had been particularly kind to London that year. October had stretched warm and golden far longer than anyone expected, with days that felt stolen from summer, and evenings that cooled just enough to make people grateful for their fireplaces. The trees along the major thoroughfares had turned slowly, reluctantly, their leaves shifting from green to amber to deep gold, with the unhurried grace of dancers who knew their performance was nearly over, but wanted to savor every remaining moment. Now, in early November, those same leaves carpeted the streets in rustling layers that caught the light and created a soft percussion under every footstep. Children had taken to kicking through the piles on their way to school, their laughter bright and sharp in the cool air, while their mothers called after them to mind their boots and not track mud through the house. Mary had noticed how the changing season seemed to affect everyone's rhythm. People walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, as if the cooling air had reminded them that winter was coming, and there was wisdom in conserving energy. Even the vendors in the markets had adjusted their calls, their voices carrying a note of gentle urgency rather than the sharp insistence of summer. Fresh apples, sweet as honey, called the fruit seller on Commercial Street, his voice floating through the fog like a lullaby. The fog seemed to collect memories, holding them suspended in its gray embrace, like precious things kept safe in tissue paper. As Mary watched from her window, she could almost see the ghosts of warmer days, children playing in the street, when the light lasted longer. Women hanging laundry that dried quickly in the July sun, men in shirt sleeves talking and laughing outside the pub when the air was too warm to stay indoors. But there was beauty in this quieter season, too. The fog brought with it a sense of mystery that made ordinary streets feel like pathways to unknown adventures. It softened the harsh realities of daily life, creating a cocoon of privacy around each person as they moved through their morning routines. In the fog, a woman carrying groceries became a figure from a fairy tale. A man walking his dog transformed into a character from a romantic novel. And even the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. The whistle of the tea kettle, the scrape of a door opening, the gentle conversation between old friends, took on the quality of secrets shared in a cathedral. Mary had developed her own morning ritual that moved in harmony with the fog's gentle pace. She would rise slowly, letting consciousness drift back to her like tide returning to shore, never rushing the transition from sleep to waking. Her small room at Miller's Court wasn't much, just large enough for a bed, a table, a chair, and a few precious possessions. But she had made it truly hers, with small touches that spoke of care and attention to beauty, despite limited means. A piece of lace carefully mended and remended covered the small table where she kept her few books. She had learned to read as a child in Wales, and though the books were borrowed or found rather than purchased, she treasured them like jewels. There was a volume of poetry with pages soft from handling a novel about life in the countryside that she returned to whenever she felt homesick, and a collection of folk tales that reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell during long winter evenings. The ritual of making tea was almost ceremonial for Mary. She had a small tin kettle that had belonged to her mother, one of the few things she had carried with her through all the moves and changes of her adult life. The kettle had a tiny dent near the handle where it had been dropped years ago, but it still sang sweetly when the water came to boil, a high, clear note that seemed to announce the official beginning of each day. While waiting for the water to heat, Mary would brush her hair with long, meditative strokes. Her hair was her pride, thick and auburn, with natural waves that caught the light even on gray days like this one. She had learned to care for it with simple ingredients. Rainwater when she could collect it. A few drops of oil traded from a neighbor who worked in a shop that sold such luxuries, and patience, lots of patience. Each morning she would brush it thoroughly, then braid it loosely, or pin it up in a style that was both practical and pretty. The fog outside seemed to muffle not just sound but time itself, creating a pocket of stillness where morning routines could unfold without hurry. Mary could hear the gradual awakening of Miller's Court around her. The soft sounds of people stirring, the whisper of curtains being drawn back, the gentle conversation between early risers who met in the shared courtyard to draw water from the communal pump. Mrs. Harvey, her neighbor, had become something of a friend over the months. She was an older woman with grown children who lived elsewhere in the city, and she had taken a protective interest in Mary that never felt intrusive or judgmental. Sometimes they would share. tea in the morning, sitting by Mary's small window and watching the street come to life. Mrs. Harvey had a way of talking that made even ordinary observations sound like poetry, commenting on how the fog made the gaslight look like stars, or how the sound of footsteps on wet cobblestones reminded her of rain on a roof. This morning, Mary could hear Mrs. Harvey moving about next door, the familiar sounds of her neighbor's morning routine creating a gentle counterpoint to her own. There was something deeply comforting about this shared rhythm, this knowledge that someone else was going through the same small rituals of waking and preparing for the day. It made the isolation of her tiny room feel less lonely, more like part of a larger symphony of daily life. The tea, when it was ready, tasted different in the fog, warmer, somehow more substantial, as if the gray air had concentrated its flavor. Mary would cup the warm mug in both hands and let the steam rise to her face, breathing in the familiar comfort of bergamot and the faint smokiness that came from leaves that had traveled halfway around the world to reach her small room in Whitechapel. Through her window, she could see shapes moving in the fog like gentle ghosts. A woman with a basket heading to market, walking with the careful steps of someone navigating by memory rather than sight. A man with a dog, the animal's tail visible as a blur of motion even when its body disappeared in the gray. Children's voices calling to each other from somewhere beyond the reach of vision, their games adapted to the mysterious world the fog had created. Dorset Street had its own personality in the fog, different from the character it wore in bright sunlight or under the harsh glare of winter skies. The fog seemed to emphasize the street's more gentle qualities, the way neighbors looked out for each other, the small kindnesses that passed between people who understood the challenges of daily survival, the quiet dignity that persisted despite the area's rough reputation in the newspapers. Mary had learned to read the street's moods over the months she had lived there. She knew which sounds meant trouble brewing and which indicated nothing more serious than a friendly disagreement over the price of bread. She could distinguish between the footsteps of people who belonged in the neighborhood and those of outsiders who moved with the wrong rhythm, either too cautious or too bold for streets that required a delicate balance of awareness and ease. The fog created new patterns of interaction. People walked closer together, called out greetings earlier to identify themselves as friends rather than strangers. Mrs. Brennan, who ran a small shop that sold everything from buttons to bread, would step outside her door more frequently on foggy mornings, becoming an unofficial lighthouse for people trying to navigate familiar streets that had been transformed by the gray air. Morning love. Mrs. Brennan would call to anyone passing by, her voice warm and reassuring. She had lived on Dorset Street for over 20 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize people by their footsteps, their cough, or the particular way they moved through the world. In the fog, she became even more valuable, a human anchor point in a landscape that had temporarily lost its visual landmarks. Mary had grown fond of these foggy mornings, partly because they seemed to bring out the best in people. The shared challenge of navigating the obscured world created a sense of community that was sometimes less visible on clear days. Strangers would offer directions to each other. Shopkeepers would call out their locations to help customers find them, and even the most reserved neighbors would exchange a few words about the weather, the visibility, or the way the fog made familiar places feel magical. From her window, Mary could see the soft glow of other windows emerging from the gray-like lanterns floating in a vast, gentle sea. Each lighted window represented a life, a story, a morning routine unfolding in parallel with her own. There was something deeply comforting about this visual reminder that she was part of a larger tapestry of human experience, that her small morning rituals connected her to countless others who were also greeting the day with tea and careful attention to simple pleasures. The fog seemed to carry scents more intensely than clear air. Mary could smell bread, baking somewhere nearby, the sharp sweetness of coal fires being lit, the green scent of the Thames mixing with the urban perfume of horse-drawn traffic and human activity. These scents layered and blended in the thick air, creating an olfactory map of the neighborhood that was as detailed and reliable as any visual guide. She had learned to navigate by these scent markers on the foggiest days. The bakery that announced itself with the warm aroma of yeast and flour. The metalworker's shop that carried the distinct smell of heated iron. The small garden behind the boarding house where someone grew herbs that released their fragrance into the passing air. These invisible landmarks had become as familiar to her as the visual ones, creating a secondary map of home that existed entirely in the realm of scent and memory. As the morning progressed, Mary could sense the fog beginning its slow retreat, not disappearing exactly, but lifting slightly like a theater curtain being raised, inch by gradual inch. The light at her window grew marginally brighter, and the shapes moving in the street became slightly more distinct. Soon, she knew the fog would lift enough to reveal the full bustling life of Dorset Street. But for now, she was content to exist in this softer, more mysterious version of her world, where every sound carried weight and every glimpse of movement felt like a small revelation. Chapter 2, Fragments of Memory. The fog seemed to invite memories, drawing them up from the depths of Mary's mind like mist rising from warm water, as she sat with her second cup of tea watching the gray world outside her window. Her thoughts drifted back to Wales, to the green valleys of her childhood where fog had been a different creature entirely, wilder, more unpredictable, rolling down from the mountains with a force that could swallow entire villages in minutes. She had been born Mary Jane Kelly in Limerick, but Wales had shaped her in ways that Ireland never could. Her family had moved when she was still small enough to be carried, crossing the Irish Sea to a land of singing voices and coal dark hills where her father found work in the mines. The cottage they lived in sat halfway up a valley wall, and Mary could still remember waking on foggy mornings to find their small home floating like an island above a sea of white, with only the tips of church spires and chimney tops visible below. Her mother had been a woman of quiet strengths, with hands that could coax music from an old piano and stories from the most reluctant child. She had taught Mary to find beauty in simple things, the way sunlight looked filtered through fog, the sound of rain on slate roofs, the taste of bread still warm from the oven. These lessons had stayed with Mary through all the years and miles that followed, helping her create pockets of grace even in the hardest circumstances. The Welsh valleys had their own rhythm, different from the relentless pace of London. There, fog meant a slower daytime for indoor activities, for sitting by the fire with handiwork or stories. Her mother would use foggy mornings to teach Mary domestic skill, showed to mend clothing so the repair was stronger than the original fabric, how to make a little food, stretch to feed more people, how to create warmth and welcome in any space. No matter how humble, Mary's father had been a gentleman with a laugh that could fill a room and hands permanently stained with coal dust. He would come home from the mines covered in black from head to toe, but he always stopped at the door to wash his face and hands before entering their small home. "A man brings his work with him," he would say, "but he doesn't have to track it through his wife's clean floors." Even now, years later, Mary could hear his voice clearly, could remember the way he would lift her up to help her reach things on high shelves, always patient when she wanted to help with tasks beyond her small capabilities. The cottage had been filled with music in those days. Her mother played piano when she could borrow time at the church. Her father had a fine singing voice that he shared generously, and Mary had learned harmonies before she learned her letters. Welsh hymns, Irish ballads, and songs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, creating a soundtrack for a childhood that, despite its material limitations, had been rich with love and attention. She remembered foggy Sunday mornings when the family would walk to church together, their footsteps muffled and their voices carrying strangely in the thick air. The stone church would emerge from the fog like something from a fairy tale, its bell tower disappearing into the gray above while warm light spilled from its windows. Inside, the fog seemed to concentrate the congregation's voices, making their singing sound like something from heaven itself. Those Welsh valleys had taught Mary about community in ways that London's more anonymous neighborhoods never could. When fog made travel dangerous, neighbors checked on each other. When someone was sick, food appeared without being requested. When times were hard, people shared what they had without keeping account of who owed what to whom. It was a different kind of survival than what she had learned in the city, one based on mutual aid rather than individual resourcefulness. Her grandmother had lived with them for several years, a woman whose story seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time. On foggy evenings, when the outside world disappeared entirely, she would tell tales of ancient Wales, of princes and poets, of women who could sing the mist down from the mountains, and men who could read the future in the patterns of clouds. Mary had absorbed these stories like a plant absorbing water, and even now they surfaced in her dreams, offering comfort when the present world felt too harsh. The move to London had come when Mary was in her teens, following a path worn smooth by countless others who had left the countryside seeking better opportunities in the great city. Her father's cough had worsened. Too many years breathing coal dust, and the family had hoped that cleaner air and different work might restore his health. It was a common hope in those days, and like many such hopes, it had proven more complicated than expected. London had been overwhelming at first, the assault on senses accustomed to valleys and village rhythms. The noise never stopped. Horses, carriages, vendors calling their wares, construction conversation, and the general hum of hundreds of thousands of people living in close proximity. The fog in London was different too, thicker and grayer, carrying the sense of industry and humanity rather than the clean smell of rain on grass. But Mary had been young enough to adapt, and she had discovered that London had its own beauty for those who knew how to look for it. The great parks with their ancient trees, the river with its constantly changing moods, the way gaslight turned fog into something magical rather than merely inconvenient. She had found work in a clothing factory, her nimble fingers proving adept at the detailed handwork that ready-made clothing required. Those early years in London had introduced her to a different kind of community. The women who worked alongside her came from all over the British Isles and beyond, Irish girls like herself, Scottish women with musical accents, English girls from farming families, and even a few who had traveled from much farther away. They had taught each other survival skills for city life, sharing information about the safest routes home, the fairest employers, and the small luxuries that could make a difficult life more bearable. Mary had learned to navigate London's social geography. During those factory years, she discovered which neighborhoods were safe for a young woman alone, which shops gave fair prices to working people, and which pubs welcomed respectable women. She learned to read the signals that distinguished between men who meant no harm and those who posed a threat, developing an intuition that had served her well in the years since. The factory work had been hard on her hands, but easy on her mind. Repetitive tasks that allowed her thoughts to wander while her fingers worked automatically. During those long hours of stitching, she had planned her future, imagined the life she would build once she had saved enough money, dreamed of perhaps returning to Wales someday, with enough resources to live comfortably. The other women shared similar dreams, and their conversations had been filled with hopes and plans that made the tedious work feel temporary rather than permanent. It was during this period that Mary had met Thomas, a young man who worked as a porter at one of the markets. He had been kind and steady, with ambitions to start his own business someday, and a respect for Mary's intelligence that was not universal among young men of their class. They had walked out together for months, taking long strolls through the parks on Sunday afternoons, sharing simple meals and complicated dreams. Thomas had been her introduction to a different kind of love than the familial affection she had known in Wales. He listened when she talked about her childhood, asked thoughtful questions about her work, and never made her feel that her dreams were too ambitious or impractical. With him, she had begun to imagine a future that included marriage, children, perhaps, a small shop or boarding house that they could run together. The relationship had ended, not with drama, but with the slow recognition that their paths were diverging in ways that could not be reconciled. Thomas had been offered work in Manchester, an opportunity too good to refuse, while Mary had obligations in London that made it impossible for her to leave. They had parted with genuine affection and mutual respect, promising to write letters that both knew would eventually fade into memory. After Thomas left, Mary had felt unmoored for a while, uncertain about the future she had been so carefully planning. The factory work suddenly felt less like a temporary situation and more like a trap, and she had begun to look for other opportunities, other ways of making her way in the world. It was during this searching period that she had met Joseph Barnett, a fish porter with gentle eyes and calloused hands, who would become her anchor in the turbulent years that followed. Joseph had entered Mary's life during one of London's harshest winters, when fog and frost combined to make the city feel like an alien landscape. She had been walking home from the factory one evening, moving carefully on ice, slicked cobblestones, when she slipped and would have fallen hard if not for his quick reflexes. He had caught her arm and steadied her, asking with genuine concern if she was hurt. What struck her immediately was not his appearance, though he was pleasant enough to look at with brown hair and kind eyes, but his manner. He spoke to her as if her well-being mattered to him, as if she were someone worthy of care and attention. In a city where young women often felt invisible, or worse, this simple courtesy had been more attractive than any amount of physical beauty. Their courtship had been conducted largely in fog during those gray winter months, when London seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. They would meet after her work, finished walking slowly through streets made mysterious by the thick air, talking about everything and nothing. Joseph had grown up in London, and he knew the city's secret places, small parks tucked between buildings, quiet corners where couples could talk without interruption, cafes that served strong tea, and didn't mind if customers lingered over a single cup. Joseph's work at Billingsgate Fish Market meant early mornings and late nights, but he had carved out time for Mary with the dedication of someone who had found something precious and had no intention of letting it slip away. He would tell her stories about the characters who worked at the market, the fishmongers with their musical calls, the buyers who could judge the quality of fish with a single glance, the complex social hierarchy that governed life among people who worked with their hands. Mary had been charmed by Joseph's stories, but even more by his respect for the people he worked alongside. He never mocked the eccentricities of his colleagues or complained about the physical demands of his job. Instead, he found humor and dignity in the daily routines of working life, treating each person he encountered as if they had something valuable to offer. They had moved in together after several months of courtship, finding a small room that they could afford on Joseph's wages from the market. It had been a happy time. Despite the material limitations, Joseph was generous with both his money and his attention, never making Mary feel like a burden, even when work was scarce and resources tight. He brought home fish from the market. She contributed her skills with needle and thread to their household economy, and together they created a life that felt stable and hopeful. The room they shared had been larger than Mary's current space, with a real fireplace and windows that looked out on a small courtyard where children played and women hung laundry. Mary had made it beautiful with the same careful attention she had learned from her mother, cleaning and arranging their few possessions so that everything had its place and purpose, finding ways to add color and warmth despite their limited resources. Joseph had loved to read aloud in the evenings, his voice carrying the day's stories from newspapers or books borrowed from a lending library. Mary would mend clothes or darn stockings while she listened, the domestic rhythm of their shared tasks creating an intimacy that felt both comfortable and precious. On foggy nights when the outside world disappeared entirely, their small room felt like the only place in existence, a warm island of human connection floating in the gray void. But even during those happy months, Mary had been aware of the precariousness of their situation. Joseph's work depended on his physical strength, and injury or illness could eliminate their income overnight. She had continued to take in sewing work when she could find it, not because they needed the money immediately, but because she understood the importance of having multiple sources of support. The fog outside her current window brought back memories of those evenings with Joseph. The way fog had made their small room feel more private and precious. Even now, years later, she could hear his voice reading aloud, could feel the contentment of sitting by firelight with someone who cared about her well-being, who noticed when she was tired or worried and made adjustments to help her feel better. Chapter 3. The Evening Light. As the November afternoon began its gentle descent toward evening, the fog started to lift just enough to allow the day's remaining light to filter through in soft, diffused rays. Mary had always loved this time of day when the world seemed to pause between the activities of afternoon and the settling quiet of evening. It was a time for small rituals for preparing both body and spirit for the coming night. She moved about her small room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of limited space. Each item had its place, each task its proper order. First, she would tidy the few things that might have become displaced during the day, smoothing the coverlet on her bed, straightening the books on her small table, ensuring that her few precious possessions were arranged just so. These movements were meditative, a way of bringing order to both her physical space and her thoughts. The light coming through her window had a particular quality in late autumn, golden but muted warm, but not quite able to dispel the chill that seemed to live in the very walls of buildings in this part of London. Mary had learned to work with this light rather than against it, timing her activities to make the most of its gentle illumination. Sewing was best done in the late afternoon when the light was strongest, while reading could wait until evening, when the gaslight would supplement the fading daylight. She had developed a ritual around the transition from day to evening that helped her feel grounded and peaceful. First, she would wash her face and hands with water from the basin using a small piece of soap that she made last as long as possible by using it sparingly and storing it carefully between uses. The water was always cold, but there was something refreshing about the shock of it, a way of marking the boundary between the days. Activities and the evening's rest. Next, she would change from her day dress into something more comfortable for evening. She had 2 dresses that were suitable for going out if needed, but several older garments that she kept for private moments. Softer fabrics, looser fits, clothes that prioritized comfort over appearance. This simple change of clothing was like shedding the public self and returning to the private person who existed only within the walls of her small room. The ritual of lighting her lamp was almost ceremonial. Mary had a small oil lamp that had been a gift from Joseph during their time together, a simple but well-made piece that cast a warm, steady light. She would clean the glass chimney carefully, trim the wick to ensure an even flame, and fill the reservoir with oil that she purchased from a shop on Commercial Street. The act of lighting the lamp felt like welcoming the evening, creating a circle of warm light that made her small room feel safe and inviting. With the lamp lit, the room transformed. Shadows danced gently on the walls, and the harsh edges of poverty were softened by the forgiving light. Her few books looked more substantial, her simple furniture more elegant, and even her worn clothing appeared more beautiful when seen through the golden glow of the oil flame. It was a transformation that happened every evening, a daily reminder that beauty could be created through attention and care rather than wealth. Mary would then prepare her evening tea, a ritual that was similar to her morning routine but somehow different in tone. Morning tea was about awakening, gathering energy for the day ahead. Evening tea was about settling, creating a sense of completion and peace. She would let the tea steep longer in the evening, making it stronger and more substantial, something that could serve as both comfort and nourishment. The sounds of the neighborhood changed as evening approached. The urgent business of day gave way to the more leisurely pace of evening. Children's voices became less frequent as they were called in for supper. The clip-clop of horses slowed as working people finished their daily tasks, and the general energy of the street shifted from activity to relaxation. These changes in the acoustic landscape of Dorset Street were as reliable as clockwork, marking the passage of time more accurately than any timepiece. The lifting fog revealed more of her neighbors as evening settled over Miller's Court. Mary had grown fond of these twilight hours, partly because they brought people together in ways that the busy daylight hours did not always allow. Windows glowed with warm light. Doors opened more frequently as people stepped out to chat with neighbors, and the shared courtyard became a gathering place for those who had finished their day's work. Mrs. Harvey appeared at her door, right on schedule as she did most evenings, carrying a cup of tea and wearing a shawl that had seen better days but was clean and neatly mended. She had a gift for timing her appearance to coincide with Mary's own evening tea, creating opportunities for companionship that never felt forced or intrusive. Tonight she paused at Mary's window, her weathered face kind in the lamplight. Lovely evening, despite the fog, Mrs. Harvey observed her voice carrying the musical accent of someone who had grown up in Ireland but lived long enough in London to acquire some of its rhythms. Makes everything look softer, doesn't it? Like the whole world's been wrapped in cotton wool. Mary invited her in as she often did, and the two women settled into the comfortable routine of shared tea and gentle conversation. Mrs. Harvey had a way of talking that was both soothing and interesting, touching on neighborhood news without ever descending into gossip, sharing observations about the weather and the seasons that revealed a poet's eye for detail. "I saw young Tommy Morrison earlier," Mrs. Harvey mentioned, referring to a boy who lived with his grandmother in one of the other rooms around the courtyard. "Been coughing something fierce, poor little thing. His grand's trying all the old remedies, but sometimes I think what those children need most is just more food, more warmth. The old ways can only do so much when the basic needs aren't met." This was typical of Mrs. Harvey's conversation, practical observations delivered with genuine compassion. She had raised children of her own and had the wisdom that comes from years of managing a household on limited resources. Mary valued these conversations, not just for the companionship they provided, but for the knowledge they contained. Mrs. Harvey knew which shops gave the best prices, which remedies actually worked for common ailments, and how to navigate the complex social relationships that governed life in their small community. The two women would often work while they talked, Mrs. Harvey bringing her mending, and Mary continuing with whatever sewing project she had in hand. There was something deeply satisfying about this combination of useful work and pleasant conversation, a way of making the evening productive, while also nurturing the social connections that made life in the crowded city bearable. Tonight, Mary was working on a simple embroidery project, adding small decorative touches to a plain dress that would help it look more fashionable and well-made. Her stitches were small and even, the result of years of practice and the patient teaching she had received from her mother and grandmother. Mrs. Harvey watched the work with appreciation, occasionally offering suggestions about color or pattern that came from her own decades of experience. "With needle and thread, you've got the gift for it," Mrs. Harvey said, examining Mary's work in the lamplight. "Steady hands and a good eye. That's worth more than people realize, especially for a woman trying to make her way in the world. A skill like that, it can keep you fed when other work is scarce." The conversation drifted naturally from topic to topic, the weather, the neighborhood memories of other places and times. Mrs. Harvey had lived in London for over 30 years, and her stories painted a picture of how the city had changed, how neighborhoods had evolved, and how people had adapted to circumstances that were constantly shifting. Her perspective helped Mary understand her own life as part of a larger pattern connected to the experiences of countless other women who had found ways to survive and sometimes thrive in difficult circumstances. As full darkness settled outside the warm circle of lamplight, made their small gathering feel even more intimate and precious. The fog, now barely visible in the darkness, continued to muffle the sounds of the street, creating a sense of privacy and protection around their quiet conversation. The evening deepened around them like a familiar blanket, and Mary found herself settling into the peaceful rhythm that had become so important to her daily routine. Mrs. Harvey had returned to her own room, leaving behind the lingering warmth of companionship and the small gift of a few biscuits she had baked earlier in the day. Such gestures were common among the women of Miller's Court, small kindnesses that acknowledged the shared challenges of their lives without ever making anyone feel like an object of charity. Mary moved through her evening preparations with the same careful attention she brought to all her daily rituals. She would bank the small fire in her grate, ensuring that some warmth would remain through the night without wasting precious fuel. She had learned this skill from her mother, who had been expert at managing the delicate balance between comfort and economy that governed working-class life. The process of preparing for sleep was almost ceremonial in its precision. She would brush her hair again, the long strokes soothing after a day of keeping it pinned up and out of the way. Her hair was one of her vanities, and she took genuine pleasure in its care, treating it as other women might treat a piece of fine jewelry. In the lamplight, it caught golden highlights that reminded her of autumn leaves of sunset on Welsh hills, of all the beautiful things she had seen in her 25 years of life. Her evening prayers were simple and personal. Not the formal recitations of her childhood, but a quiet conversation with whatever force governed the universe. She prayed for her health, for the continued kindness of her neighbors, for safety through the night, and strength for the day to come. Sometimes she prayed for people from her past, their parents long dead, Joseph wherever he might be, Thomas in Manchester, all the people who had touched her life and helped shape the person she had become. The lamp would be the last thing extinguished. Its warm light reluctantly surrendered to the darkness. But even in darkness, Mary's small room retained the sense of order and care that she had built into every corner. Her few possessions were arranged with thought and intention, creating an environment that supported rest and peace despite the challenges that surrounded it. Outside, the fog continued its patient work, softening the harsh edges of Dorset Street and creating a cocoon of quiet around the small community of Miller's Court. The gaslight from the street lamp created a soft glow that penetrated even the thick curtains, providing just enough illumination to make the darkness feel friendly rather than threatening. Mary had learned to find comfort in the sounds of evening. The settling of the building as temperatures dropped, the distant murmur of conversation from other rooms, the occasional footstep of someone returning home late from work. These sounds spoke of life continuing around her, of a community of people all engaged in the same basic activities of survival and rest. The bed, when she finally settled into it, felt like a reward for the day's efforts. The sheets were clean, the blankets adequate if not luxurious, and the pillow soft enough to cradle her head comfortably. She had learned to appreciate these simple comforts deeply, never taking for granted the security of a warm, private place to sleep. As consciousness began to fade at the edges, Mary's thoughts drifted back over the day. The beauty of the morning fog, the satisfaction of completed tasks, the warmth of Mrs. Harvey's friendship, the small pleasures that had marked the passage of hours. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but for now she was content to rest in the present moment, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life lived with attention and care. The fog outside continued its ancient work, transforming the familiar into the mysterious, creating a world where ordinary things became beautiful, and where the harsh realities of daily life were temporarily softened by nature's gentle artistry. Chapter 4. Shadows and Whispers. The fear had been growing in Whitechapel for months now. Not the sharp terror that comes with sudden danger, but the slower, more insidious anxiety that settles into a community like fog, itself gradually, persistently changing the very air people breathe. Mary had watched it transform her neighborhood in subtle ways, altering the rhythm of daily life without completely destroying the fabric of community that held people together. It began with small changes in behavior that might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, but spoke volumes to those who lived within the intricate social network of the streets. Women who had once walked alone after dark now moved in pairs or groups, their voices a little louder, their laughter a little more forced. Shopkeepers began closing their doors earlier, and the warm pools of light that spilled from pub windows seemed to contract, as if even the buildings themselves were drawing inward for protection. Mary had noticed how conversations changed too. Where once neighbors might have discussed the weather, the price of bread, or the latest news from the papers, now there was an undercurrent of wariness that colored even the most ordinary exchanges. People spoke in lower voices, glanced over their shoulders more frequently, and shared information with the careful precision of those who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between safety and danger. Mrs. Harvey had been particularly affected by the growing tension. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to remember when the biggest concerns were unemployment, harsh winters, and the everyday struggles of working-class life. Now she found herself lying awake at night listening to footsteps in the courtyard with an attention that would have been unnecessary just a year ago. "It's not right," she had said to Mary just a few evenings before, her usually steady voice carrying a tremor of uncertainty. "A woman should be able to walk from here to the market without feeling like she's being watched, without having to plan her route like she's crossing enemy territory. This used to be a rough neighborhood. He'll grant you that, but it was our rough neighborhood. We knew what to expect, how to manage. This is different. This feels like something from outside, something that doesn't understand the rules we live by." The newspapers had not helped matters. Their sensational reporting had painted the entire area with a broad brush of danger and degradation, transforming the complex reality of working-class life into lurid headlines designed to thrill readers who lived safely distant from the streets they described. Mary had learned to read these accounts with a mixture of anger and sadness, recognizing how little they captured of the actual texture of life in Whitechapel. The reporters who occasionally ventured into the neighborhood moved through it like explorers in a foreign land, seeing only what confirmed their preconceptions about poverty and vice. They missed the small acts of kindness that occurred daily, the networks of mutual support that helped people survive, the dignity with which most residents conducted their lives despite material limitations. But the fear was real, regardless of how it was portrayed in the press. Mary had felt it herself. On recent evening walks, a prickle of awareness between her shoulder blades, a heightened attention to sounds and movements that would have passed unnoticed in safer times. She had developed new habits, checking the street more carefully before leaving her room, varying her routes to and from familiar destinations, trusting her instincts when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't identify exactly what had triggered her concern. The strange thing was how the fear coexisted with the ordinary business of living. People still needed to work, to shop, to visit friends, to conduct all the daily activities that make up a life. They had learned to carry the fear lightly, not allowing it to paralyze them, but not ignoring it either. It became another factor to consider when making decisions like weather or money or health. Important, but not overwhelming, Mary had watched her neighbors adapt with a resilience that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Women developed systems for checking on each other, creating informal networks of communication that ensured someone would notice if a person failed to appear at their usual times and places. Men walked their wives, daughters, and female friends home from work with a protectiveness that managed to feel caring rather than patronizing. The community's response to the growing fear had revealed both the best and the most complicated aspects of human nature Mary had witnessed. Acts of extraordinary kindness, strangers offering to accompany lone women on evening errands, shopkeepers extending credit to customers who were afraid to venture out to other establishments, neighbors sharing resources more freely as people drew together for mutual protection. At the same time, she had seen how fear could bring out suspicion and prejudice. Outsiders were viewed with more hostility than before, and even longtime residents found themselves subject to scrutiny if their behavior deviated from expected patterns. Mrs. Cox, who lived in one of the other rooms in Miller's Court, had become the subject of whispered speculation. simply because she kept irregular hours and had visitors that some neighbors considered questionable. Mary tried to maintain her own sense of balance amid these shifting social currents. She had no desire to live in constant terror, but she wasn't foolish enough to ignore legitimate concerns about safety. She had developed what she thought of as intelligent caution, paying attention to her surroundings without becoming paralyzed by fear, taking reasonable precautions without allowing anxiety to control her choices. The women of the neighborhood had begun to share information more systematically than before. They exchanged observations about unusual activity, described encounters with strangers who had made them uncomfortable, and passed along warnings about areas or times that seemed particularly risky. This informal intelligence network operated through conversations at the market, brief exchanges in doorways, and the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who live in close proximity. Mary had become part of this network almost without realizing it. She found herself noting details that would have escaped her attention in more peaceful times. The appearance of unfamiliar men in the area, changes in the usual patterns of foot traffic conversations that stopped abruptly when women approached. She shared these observations with trusted neighbors like Mrs. Harvey, contributing to a collective pool of knowledge that helped everyone make better decisions about their daily activities. The children of the neighborhood had been affected too, though their parents tried to shield them from the worst of the adult anxiety. Mary had noticed that they played closer to home. Now their games more subdued, their voices not quite as loud as they had been during the carefree summer months. Some of the older children had taken on additional responsibilities, walking younger siblings to and from school, helping with errands that would have been done by women alone in previous years. Despite the fear, or perhaps because of it, there was an increased sense of solidarity among the residents of Dorset Street and the surrounding area. People who had previously maintained polite but distant relationships now checked on each other more regularly. The boundaries between neighbors had become more permeable, with people sharing resources and information that they might have kept private in more settled times. Mary had benefited from this increased community spirit. Mrs. Harvey had introduced her to other women in the area, expanding her social network and providing additional sources of support and friendship. She had been invited to join an informal group that met weekly to share tea and conversation, ostensibly for the purpose of needlework, but actually serving as a forum for mutual support and the exchange of practical information. These gatherings had become increasingly important to Mary, providing not just companionship but also a sense of belonging to something larger than her individual circumstances. The women who attended came from various backgrounds and situations, but they shared the common experience of trying to maintain dignity and safety in challenging times. Their conversations ranged from practical matters like budgeting and household management to more personal topics like hopes, fears, and memories of better times. In the midst of all this community adaptation, Mary had found herself thinking more deeply about the nature of safety and security. She had always understood that her position as a woman living independently in Victorian London carried certain inherent risks, but the recent events had forced her to examine these risks more carefully and to develop more sophisticated strategies for managing them. She had come to realize that true safety was not just about avoiding physical danger, though that was certainly important. It was also about maintaining the emotional and psychological resources necessary to navigate uncertainty with grace and wisdom. This meant cultivating relationships that provided support, developing skills that increased her options, and nurturing the inner strength that would sustain her through difficult periods. Mary's evening conversations with Mrs. Harvey had become particularly valuable in this regard. The older woman had lived through various difficult periods and had developed a philosophical approach to uncertainty that Mary found both comforting and practical. Mrs. Harvey spoke about fear as something to be acknowledged but not dominated by a natural response to genuine threats that could become destructive if allowed to grow beyond proportion. The trick Mrs. Harvey had said during one of their recent evening talks is to remain alert without becoming anxious, cautious without becoming paralyzed. Fear can be a useful servant, but it makes a terrible master. The women who survive and thrive in times like these are the ones who learn to listen to their instincts without letting those instincts make all their decisions for them. This wisdom had resonated deeply with Mary, helping her find a middle path between reckless disregard for danger and crippling anxiety about potential threats. She had learned to trust her intuitive responses to people and situations while also applying rational analysis to the information available to her. This combination of emotional intelligence and logical thinking had served her well in navigating the complex social landscape of her neighborhood. The fog that evening seemed to echo the psychological atmosphere that had settled over Whitechapel, not entirely hostile, but requiring careful navigation, transforming familiar landscapes into something more mysterious and potentially dangerous. Mary had learned to find beauty even in this changed environment, appreciating the way the muted light created intimate spaces for conversation and reflection. As she prepared for sleep that night, Mary reflected on how the community had changed and adapted over the past months. Despite the fear and uncertainty, or perhaps because of them, people had discovered reserves of strength and compassion that might have remained hidden in more comfortable times. Neighbors had become friends. Strangers had become allies, and the abstract concept of community had been transformed into a concrete network of mutual support. She felt grateful to be part of this network even as she remained aware of its limitations. No amount of community solidarity could completely eliminate the risks that came with being a woman in her circumstances, but it could provide the support and resources necessary to manage those risks intelligently. As she settled into sleep, Mary carried with her a sense of being held by something larger than herself. Not just the physical warmth of her small room, but the invisible web of care and concern that connected her to her neighbors and friends. The fog outside continued its patient work, creating a soft barrier between the intimate world of Miller's Court and the larger uncertainties of the city beyond. Chapter 5. The Last Supper. The knock on Mary's door came just as she was settling in for what she had expected to be a quiet evening alone. It was a familiar rhythm, 2 quick taps followed by a pause, then one more, and her heart lifted with recognition before her mind had fully processed the sound. Joseph stood in the doorway when she opened it, his cap in his hands, and a tentative smile on his weathered face, looking both hopeful and uncertain in the way of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who had once been intimate but now had to negotiate the complex territory of changed relationships. "I was in the neighborhood, finished work earlier than usual, and I thought, well, I wondered if you might like some company for supper." Mary felt the familiar flutter of mixed emotions that Joseph's presence always brought, affection tangled with regret, comfort shadowed by the memory of pain, the recognition of genuine care complicated by the practical realities that had driven them apart. But the fog outside made the evening feel particularly lonely, and the prospect of sharing a meal with someone who knew her well was more appealing than the solitude she had planned. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I was just thinking how quiet it was tonight. Come in, sit by the fire. You look cold." Joseph had indeed brought food, as if he had planned this visit more carefully than his casual words suggested. From his coat pockets he produced a small loaf of bread that was still faintly warm, some cheese wrapped carefully in brown paper, and 2 apples that showed signs of having been polished to a shine. It was a simple meal, but assembled with the kind of attention that spoke of someone who had put thought into creating a pleasant evening. Mary set about preparing the food while Joseph settled into her single chair, his large frame making the small room feel even smaller, but not uncomfortably so. There was something deeply familiar about his presence, the way he sat slightly forward, elbows on his knees, the careful way he placed his cap on the table, the unconscious movements of a man who had once shared this space and still remembered its rhythms. The fog's been thick all day, Joseph observed, filling the silence with the kind of comfortable conversation that had always characterized their relationship, made work interesting, I can tell you. You can barely see the boats on the river, and the vendors at the market have been calling out their locations every few minutes so customers can find them. Mary smiled at this image, remembering Joseph's gift for finding humor in everyday difficulties. It was one of the things she had always appreciated about him, his ability to see the lighter side of circumstances that might frustrate others, his talent for making even challenging situations feel manageable through the simple act of paying attention to their absurd details. As they arranged the simple meal between them, Mary was struck by how natural it felt to share this domestic ritual with Joseph again. They had done this hundreds of times during their months together, and their bodies seemed to remember the choreography of cooperation, passing items, without needing to ask, moving around each other in the small space without collision, creating a temporary partnership for the business of eating. The bread was indeed fresh, with a crust that crackled when broken, and a soft interior that absorbed the butter Joseph had also thoughtfully provided. The cheese was sharp and creamy, the kind of simple pleasure that could transform an ordinary meal into something memorable. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the unexpected gift of companionship on what might otherwise have been a solitary evening. "You've made the room beautiful," Joseph said, looking around at the small improvements Mary had made since their separation. "It always had potential, but you've brought it out. That lace at the window, the way you've arranged everything. It feels like a home, not just a place to sleep." The compliment warmed Mary more than she had expected. Joseph had always noticed. Such things had always appreciated her efforts to create beauty and comfort despite limited resources. It was one of the reasons their relationship had been so meaningful to her. He saw and valued the care she put into the details of daily life. Understanding that these small acts of creation were both necessity and art. As they shared the simple meal, conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of people who had once known each other intimately and still retained enough affection to find pleasure in each other's company. Joseph told stories about his work at the fish market, describing the colorful characters he encountered daily with the warm humor that had always been one of his most attractive qualities. "Old Murphy was in rare form today," he said, referring to one of the longtime vendors at Billingsgate. "You know how he gets when the fog's thick starts, claiming he can identify fish by smell alone even through the fog." Had a whole crowd gathered around him while he performed his demonstrations, eyes closed, sniffing away like a bloodhound. "Half the time I think he's making it up, but the other half, well, the man's been selling fish for 40 years. Maybe he really can tell a Dover sole from a place just by breathing near it." Mary laughed, appreciating both the story and Joseph's gift for storytelling. He had a way of bringing the world of the markets alive, making her feel connected to the larger life of London, even when her own days were spent mostly in the confines of her small room and the immediate neighborhood. Through his eyes, she could see the humor and humanity in situations that outsiders might view as merely rough or crude. The conversation gradually grew more personal, touching on the changes in their lives since they had parted ways. Joseph spoke carefully about his current lodgings, a shared room with 2 other men that provided adequate shelter, but none of the comfort or privacy that their former arrangement had offered. Mary could hear the loneliness in his voice, though he was too proud to state it directly. "I miss this," he said eventually, gesturing around the small room but clearly meaning something larger than just the physical space. "Not just the room, though. This was always more comfortable than anywhere else I've lived. I miss the companionship, I suppose. Coming home to someone who was glad to see me, having someone to share the day's stories with, making plans together, even small ones. It made everything feel more worthwhile somehow." Mary felt her chest tighten with a familiar ache. She missed those things too, the sense of partnership, the shared domestic routines, the feeling of being part of something larger than her individual existence. But she also remembered the reasons they had separated, the practical difficulties that had made their relationship unsustainable, despite the genuine affection between them. "I miss it too," she said quietly. more than I sometimes let myself admit. You were always kind to me, Joseph. You never made me feel like I was a burden, even when money was tight. That meant more to me than you probably realized." Joseph reached across the small table and briefly touched her hand, a gesture that was both intimate and respectful, acknowledging their shared history while respecting the boundaries that now existed between them. His hand was rough from work but warm, and Mary found herself remembering all the ways he had shown his care through touch-gentle hands when she was sick, strong arms when she needed comfort, the simple pleasure of being held by someone who valued her presence. "We were good together," Joseph said softly. "Maybe the circumstances weren't right. Maybe the timing was wrong. But we were good together. I hope you know that whatever happened afterward, whatever difficulties we faced, those months we shared were some of the happiest of my life." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made Mary's eyes fill with unexpected tears. She had wondered sometimes if Joseph remembered their time together with the same mixture of warmth and regret that she did, or if the practical necessities that had driven them apart had overshadowed the genuine happiness they had shared. They were happy times, she agreed, even when things were difficult, even when we were worried about money or work. There was something solid about being together, something that made everything else feel manageable. As the evening deepened around them, their conversation grew even more intimate, touching on subjects that had been too painful to discuss during the actual process of separation. They talked about the dreams they had shared, the small shop they had imagined opening together, the cottage outside London, where they might have lived if Joseph's work had allowed it, the children they had. They both wanted, but had been too practical to bring into their uncertain circumstances. "I still think about that sometimes," Joseph admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The life we might have had if things had been different, not regretting the choices we made. I understand why we made them, but wondering what might have been possible in a different world with different circumstances." Mary nodded, understanding completely. She too had those moments of wondering, usually late at night when the small room felt particularly empty, when she imagined how different her life might have been if Joseph's income had been more stable, if her own opportunities had been greater, if the economic realities of working-class life had been less harsh and unforgiving. But tonight, in the warm circle of lamplight with the fog creating a sense of privacy around their small gathering, the sadness of those lost possibilities felt less bitter than usual. Instead, there was something almost peaceful about acknowledging what had been beautiful in their relationship, while accepting what had made it impossible to sustain. "Do you ever think we might?" Joseph began, then stopped himself as if recognizing that some questions were better left unasked. But Mary understood what he had been about to say, and she felt the same uncertain hope that he did, the wondering whether their current circumstances might allow for something that had been impossible before. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Sometimes I think about it, but I also know that the reasons we separated haven't really changed. You're still doing work that doesn't pay enough to support two people comfortably, and I'm still trying to find ways to be independent that don't require me to depend entirely on someone else's income. Maybe those aren't problems that can't be solved, but they're still problems." Joseph nodded, respecting her honesty even as she could see the disappointment in his eyes. It was one of the things she had always appreciated about him, his ability to hear difficult truths without becoming defensive or angry. His understanding that practical considerations were not the enemy of love, but simply one of the factors that had to be taken into account when making decisions about how to live. As they finished the last of the bread and cheese, they both seemed to recognize that this evening had been a gift, a chance to remember what had been good between them, to acknowledge what had been lost, and to treat each other with the kindness that their shared history deserved. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promises about the future, but there was something valuable in simply being able to sit together peacefully. sharing food and conversation without the pain that had characterized their final months together. "Thank you for this," Mary said, as Joseph prepared to leave, gesturing toward the remnants of their shared meal, but meaning something much larger. "For coming by, for bringing supper, for reminding me of the good things. Sometimes it's easy to forget when you're focused on just getting through each day that there have been genuinely happy times." Joseph smiled, and for a moment he looked younger, more like the man she had first met on that icy street months ago. "Thank you for letting me stay, for sharing this with me. Whatever happens, Mary, I want you to know that knowing you has made me a better man. You've taught me things about kindness, about making beauty out of very little, about dignity in difficult circumstances that I'll carry with me wherever I go." Chapter 6. Night Falls. Slowly. After Joseph left, Mary stood for a long moment in her doorway, watching his figure disappear into the fog that had thickened again with the coming of full darkness. The night air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, damp earth, and the river, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and mysterious. She could hear the distant sounds of the city settling into evening, the clip-clop of a late carriage, the closing of shop doors, the muffled conversations of people making their way home from work. The transition from the warmth of shared company to solitude felt particularly pronounced tonight. The small room, which had seemed so alive and welcoming with Joseph's presence, now felt larger somehow, as if his departure had taken with it more than just the physical space he had occupied. Mary moved slowly through the ritual of clearing away the remnants of their meal. Each action deliberate and thoughtful, a way of processing the complex emotions that the evening had stirred. She saved the small piece of bread that remained, wrapping it carefully in a clean cloth. Joseph had always brought more food than they could finish in one sitting, and she had learned to appreciate these small gifts that extended the pleasure of his visits into the following day. Tomorrow's breakfast would taste of tonight's companionship, carrying forward the warmth of shared conversation into the solitary morning hours. The simple act of washing the few dishes they had used became almost meditative. The water was cold as always, but there was something soothing about the familiar routine of cleaning and arranging, of restoring order to her small domain. Each movement was practiced and efficient, the result of months of living in this space and learning to make the most of its limited facilities. As she worked, Mary found herself thinking about the strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that Joseph's visit had brought. There had been genuine pleasure in his company, real joy in sharing food and conversation with someone who knew her well and cared about her well-being. But there had also been the sharp awareness of what was missing from her daily life, the companionship, the sense of partnership, the simple human warmth that came from sharing space with someone who was glad to see her at the end of each day. She had grown accustomed to solitude over the months since their separation, had even learned to find peace and contentment in her independent life. But evenings like this reminded her that adaptation was not the same as preference, that learning to live alone did not mean that alone was how she most wanted to live. The recognition brought neither self-pity nor despair, simply a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what she had gained and what she had lost in choosing independence over security. The fog outside seemed to press against her windows like a living thing, creating a cocoon of privacy around her small room. In this weather, the boundaries between public and private space became more fluid, as if the thick air had created a series of small, intimate worlds, separated from each other by veils of gray. Mary found this atmosphere conducive to reflection, to the kind of deep thinking that was sometimes difficult when the outside world felt too immediate and demanding. She moved to her window and looked out into the night, though there was little to see beyond the soft glow of the street lamp and the occasional shadowy figure moving through the fog. The gaslight created a small pool of visibility in the vast, gray darkness, and she found herself thinking about how it served as a beacon for anyone trying to navigate the transformed landscape of familiar streets. The neighborhood sounds were different at night, muffled by the fog, but somehow more intimate. She could hear Mrs. Harvey moving about in the next room, the gentle sounds of an older woman preparing for sleep. From somewhere across the courtyard came the soft murmur of voices, probably neighbors sharing a late cup of tea or discussing the events of the day. These sounds created a sense of community even in isolation, a reminder that she was part of a larger network of people, all engaged in the same basic activities of daily survival and small comfort. Mary began her own preparations for sleep with the same careful attention she brought to all her evening rituals. She had learned to make these small ceremonies meaningful, transforming the practical necessities of bedtime into moments of self-care and reflection. Each action was deliberate and mindful, a way of honoring both her physical needs and her emotional well-being. First, she tended to the fire, banking the coals carefully to ensure that some warmth would remain through the night without wasting precious fuel. The small grate held heat well, and she had become skilled at managing it for maximum efficiency. The process required patience and attention, qualities that the evening's gentle pace had helped her cultivate. She changed from her day dress into her nightgown, a simple garment that had been mended several times but was still serviceable and comfortable. The fabric was soft from many washings, and putting it on felt like wrapping herself in familiar comfort. She had learned to appreciate these small luxuries: clean clothing, adequate warmth, the simple pleasure of garments that fit well and felt good against her skin. The ritual of brushing her hair was particularly soothing tonight. The long, rhythmic strokes helped quiet her mind while caring for one of her few vanities. In the lamplight, her hair took on golden highlights that reminded her of happier times of evenings when Joseph would watch her perform this same ritual, sometimes offering to help with the brushing when her arms grew tired. As she braided her hair loosely for sleep, Mary found herself thinking about the conversation she and Joseph had shared earlier. His words about missing their companionship had resonated deeply, touching on feelings she usually kept carefully controlled. The loneliness of her current life was not overwhelming, but it was constant, a low note that colored even her most contented moments. Yet there had been something healing about being able to discuss their shared past without anger or bitterness, to acknowledge what had been beautiful in their relationship, while accepting the practical realities that had made it unsustainable. The conversation had left her feeling neither hopeful nor despairing about the future, but rather peaceful about the present, grateful for what had been and accepting of what was. She prepared her evening tea with particular care, making it stronger than usual and adding a small amount of honey that she had been saving for special occasions. The sweetness felt appropriate for a night that had been marked by both the pleasure of companionship and the bittersweet recognition of what could not be reclaimed. The warm liquid was comforting, creating a sense of internal warmth that complemented the external comfort of her small, well-tended room. The sounds from the street had grown quieter as the evening progressed, the fog and the hour combining to create an atmosphere of deep tranquility. Occasionally, she heard footsteps passing by, but they were muffled and distant, more like the memory of sound than sound itself. The isolation felt protective rather than lonely, as if the fog had created a safe harbor where she could rest without worry. Mary took out one of her books, a collection of poetry that she had read many times but still found comforting. The familiar words had the quality of old friends offering solace without demanding attention, providing gentle entertainment for the quiet hour before sleep. She read slowly, savoring the rhythm of the verses and the way the lamplight made the pages seem warm and inviting. As the evening deepened toward true night, Mary felt herself settling into the peaceful state that had become her goal for these final hours before sleep. The combination of physical comfort, emotional reflection, and the gentle sensory experience of her small warm room created a sense of completeness that was rare in her daily life, but precious when it occurred. She thought about the pattern of her days, the way each small ritual and routine contributed to a larger sense of purpose and meaning. The morning tea, the careful tending of her possessions, the conversations with neighbors, the work that occupied her hands and mind. of these activities were modest in scope but significant in their cumulative effect. They created a life that was dignified and purposeful despite its material limitations. The evening's visit from Joseph had reminded her that she was capable of maintaining relationships that transcended the practical circumstances that had shaped them. Their conversation had been marked by genuine affection and mutual respect, proof that the care they had shared had not been diminished by the necessity of their separation. This recognition brought a sense of hope that was not tied to any specific expectation about the future, but rather to a general confidence in her ability to navigate whatever circumstances might arise. Mary found herself thinking about the other people in her life, Mrs. Harvey with her gentle wisdom, the women who gathered for their weekly needlework sessions, the shopkeepers and neighbors who had become familiar presences in her daily routine. Each of these relationships contributed something valuable to her sense of belonging and connection, creating a social network that supported her independence while enriching her solitary life. The fog outside continued its patient work, transforming the familiar landscape of her neighborhood into something mysterious and beautiful. Through her window, she could see how the gaslight created soft halos in the thick air, turning ordinary street lamps into something magical. The effect was calming and lovely, a reminder that beauty could be found in even the most common circumstances if one knew how to look for it. As she prepared to extinguish her lamp and surrender to sleep, Mary felt a deep sense of gratitude for the day that was ending. It had not been remarkable in any obvious way. No dramatic events, no significant changes in her circumstances, no news that would alter the course of her life, but it had been rich with small pleasures and meaningful moments marked by beauty, both natural and created, touched by human connection and solitary peace. The final ritual of the evening was the careful extinguishing of her lamp, a process that required attention to ensure that no fire hazard remained, but that also marked the formal transition from day to night, from consciousness to rest. As the warm light faded and her room settled into darkness, Mary felt herself sinking deeper into the comfort of her bed, her body relaxing into the familiar support of mattress and pillows. The darkness felt friendly rather than threatening, enhanced by the continuing presence of the fog that created a sense of privacy and protection around her small world. The distant sounds of the neighborhood, the settling of buildings, the occasional footstep, the murmur of late conversations provided a gentle soundtrack that spoke of life continuing around her, of a community of people all engaged in the same basic activities of rest and renewal. As consciousness began to fade at the edges, Mary's thoughts drifted peacefully over the events of the day and the possibilities of tomorrow, carrying her gently towards sleep, with the satisfaction of someone who had lived fully within her circumstances and found reasons for contentment even in times of uncertainty. Chapter 7. In the Quiet Hours. The deep hours of night settled over Miller's Court like a soft blanket, bringing with them a quality of silence that was different from the quieter moments of evening. This was the profound stillness that comes when most of the world has surrendered to sleep, when even the most persistent sounds of city life fade to whispers, and when time itself seems to slow and thicken like the fog that continued to wrap the neighborhood in its gentle embrace. Mary lay in her small bed, not quite asleep but no longer fully awake, existing in that peaceful liminal space where consciousness drifts like a boat on calm water. Her breathing had settled into the slow, deep rhythm of approaching sleep, and her body had found the perfect position of comfort among her modest bedclothes. The room around her held the accumulated warmth of the day, creating a cocoon of comfort that felt both secure and nurturing. The fog outside seemed to have reached its densest point, transforming the familiar geography of Dorset Street into something entirely new. Through her small window, Mary could see nothing beyond the faint glow of the street lamp, which appeared as a soft golden orb floating in a sea of gray. The effect was both mysterious and peaceful, as if her small room had been transported to some otherworldly realm where ordinary concerns could not penetrate. In this deep quiet, the small sounds of the night became more noticeable, and somehow more significant. The settling of wooden beams as the temperature dropped, the distant whisper of wind moving through the fog, the barely audible breathing of Mrs. Harvey in the next room. Of these sounds created a gentle symphony of life, continuing in its most basic forms. Mary found these sounds deeply comforting evidence that she was part of a larger community of living beings, all engaged in the same fundamental activities of rest and renewal. Her thoughts drifted peacefully over the events of the day, returning again and again to the unexpected pleasure of Joseph's visit. The conversation they had shared felt like a gift, a reminder that human connection could transcend the practical difficulties that sometimes made relationships impossible to sustain. There had been something healing about being able to speak honestly about their shared past without bitterness or false hope, acknowledging what had been beautiful while accepting what could not be reclaimed. The memory of their simple meal together brought a smile to Mary's drowsy features. The bread had been particularly good, fresh and warm, with a perfect crust, and the cheese had been sharp and creamy in just the right proportions. But more than the food itself, she treasured the memory of sharing it, of the easy conversation and gentle laughter that had accompanied their modest feast. Such moments of genuine happiness were precious in her daily life to be savored and remembered with gratitude as sleep beckoned. More insistently, Mary's mind began to wander into the realm of dreams and half-dreams that occupied the border between waking and sleeping. She found herself thinking about Wales, about the cottage where she had spent her childhood, about mornings when fog rolled down from the mountains and transformed the entire valley into a land of mystery and magic. In her drowsy state, the fog outside her London window seemed to connect her to those distant memories, creating a bridge across time and space that made her feel less alone. The sounds of the neighborhood had faded to almost nothing now, leaving only the most persistent and gentle noises, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of air moving through small spaces, the soft percussion of her own heartbeat and breathing. These sounds created a rhythm that was both soothing and hypnotic, drawing her deeper into the peaceful state that preceded true sleep. Mary's last coherent thought before sleep claimed her was a feeling of gratitude for the day that was ending and quiet anticipation for the day that would come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but for now, she was content to rest in the present moment, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with care and attention, supported by the invisible network of relationships that connected her to her community and her past. In the deepest part of the night, when even the most persistent sounds of the city had faded to whispers, Mary moved through the gentle landscape of dreams that carried echoes of her waking life, but transformed them into something more fluid and mysterious. Her sleeping mind wove together memories, hopes, and the day's experiences into narratives that followed, dream logic rather than the stricter requirements of conscious thought. She dreamed of walking through fog so thick that she could see only a few steps ahead, but instead of feeling lost or frightened, she moved with the confidence of someone following a familiar path. The fog in her dream was luminous, shot through with silver light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, creating a world that was both mysterious and beautiful. She could hear voices calling softly in the distance, familiar voices that spoke her name with warmth and recognition. In the dream, she was not alone. Shadowy figures moved beside her through the fog, companions whose faces she could not quite see, but whose presence felt comforting and protective. Sometimes she recognized elements of these dream companions. Joseph's gentle laugh, Mrs. Harvey's wise voice, her mother's patient hands, but they blended and shifted in the way that dream figures do, representing not specific people but the general human qualities of kindness, wisdom, and care. The landscape through which they moved was neither fully London nor entirely Wales, but something that combined elements of both places in the seamless way that dreams can merge different times and locations. She walked on cobblestones that gradually became grass, past buildings that transformed into trees, heard the sound of the Thames mixing with the music of Welsh streams, All of these transformations felt natural and right in the context of the dream, as if her sleeping mind was showing her how all the places she had loved were really part of one larger geography of home. Meanwhile, the fog outside her window continued its patient work, moving through the narrow streets and alleys of Whitechapel with the slow persistence of something that understood its own purpose. It touched every surface with gentle fingers, softening the harsh edges of urban life and creating a temporary world where ordinary rules were suspended and new possibilities could emerge. The building around Mary's small room settled deeper into the quiet rhythms of night. Mrs. Harvey's gentle snoring created a steady counterpoint to the other soft sounds, while from somewhere in the distance came the occasional footstep of someone making their way home through the fog. These sounds were muffled and mysterious, transformed by the thick air into something that seemed to come from another world entirely. In her dream, Mary found herself in a warm kitchen that combined elements of her childhood home in Wales with the small room she had shared with Joseph. She was preparing food for people she could not quite see, but whose appreciation she could feel in the atmosphere of warmth and gratitude that surrounded her work. The simple act of cooking became in the dream a form of magic that created not just nourishment but connection, community, and love. The fog in the dream began to lift gradually, revealing a landscape that was both familiar and entirely new. She could see hills in the distance that reminded her of Wales, but they were covered with buildings that had the comfortable proportions of her London neighborhood rivers wound between the hills, and she could hear the sound of water moving over stones, mixed with the familiar sounds of city life, vendors calling their wares, children playing, the general hum of human activity conducted with joy rather than desperation. As the dream continued, Mary felt herself moving toward something, not a specific destination, but a sense of arrival, of coming home to a place that had been waiting for her. The fog continued to lift, and the light grew stronger, though it remained gentle and welcoming rather than harsh. She could feel herself approaching wakefulness, but the transition was so gradual and peaceful that it felt like another part of the dream rather than an ending to it. In the hours just before dawn, as the fog began its gradual retreat, and the first hint of light touched the eastern edge of the sky, Mary's sleep deepened into the most restful phase of the night. Her breathing became even more regular and peaceful, her body completely relaxed into the comfort of her small bed, her face serene with the particular peace that comes from truly restorative rest. The neighborhood around Miller's Court remained wrapped in quiet, but there were subtle signs that the night was beginning its slow transition toward morning. The fog was lifting almost imperceptibly, revealing slightly more of the familiar landscape with each passing hour. The gaslight from the street lamp became marginally brighter as the thick air thinned, and the sounds of early morning activity, a distant church bell, the clip-clop of a milk wagon. The first stirrings of people preparing for the day's work began to penetrate the gray silence, but these changes occurred so gradually that they disturbed neither Mary's sleep nor the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the small community. The transition from night to morning was gentle and unhurried, allowing those who slept to continue their rest while slowly preparing the world for their eventual awakening. Mary's dreams had evolved into something even more peaceful, a sense of floating in warm water under a sky that was neither fully dark nor completely light. In this dream state she felt supported and cared for, as if invisible hands were ensuring her comfort and safety. The anxieties and challenges of her waking life seemed distant and manageable, replaced by a profound sense that all was well, that she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by love even when she could not see its source. The fog that had dominated the evening and night began to show signs of lifting, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less dense, allowing more light to filter through its gray veil. This change brought subtle shifts to the atmosphere of the neighborhood. Sounds carried a little farther. The air felt slightly less intimate, and the sense of being enclosed in a private world began to give way to awareness of the larger city beyond. Mrs. Harvey stirred in the next room, her internal clock beginning to sense the approach of morning. despite the continued gray light. Her movements were soft and careful, the practiced motions of someone who had learned to wake gently and disturb her neighbors as little as possible. The small sounds she made, the rustle of bedclothes, the soft footfalls as she moved about her room, were barely audible, but somehow comforting evidence that the community was beginning to stir toward wakefulness. In her deepest sleep, Mary seemed to sense these subtle changes without being awakened by them. Her breathing remained steady and peaceful, but there was perhaps a slight shift in her position, a gradual movement toward the lighter sleep that would eventually carry her back to consciousness. Her face retained its expression of profound peace, suggesting that her dreams continued to be gentle and restorative. The mystery of what would happen when morning fully arrived remained suspended in the gray air, neither urgent nor troubling, but simply present as one of the many uncertainties that shaped daily life in this corner of London. The fog held all possibilities within its gray embrace, concealing and protecting the small dramas of human existence that would unfold with the coming of full daylight. For now, in these last hours of truly deep night, all was peaceful and secure. Mary slept the deep sleep of someone who had lived fully within her circumstances, who had found reasons for gratitude and moments of genuine happiness, despite the challenges that surrounded her. Her rest was the rest of someone who had given care and attention to the details of daily life, who had maintained her dignity and humanity in difficult circumstances, who had created beauty and meaning within the constraints of her situation. The fog continued its ancient work, softening and transforming, creating a world where ordinary things became mysterious, and where the harsh realities of daily life were temporarily suspended in favor of something more gentle and forgiving. Chapter 8. Dawns. Early light. The fog began to lift with the same gentle patience it had shown in its arrival, revealing the world piece by piece like a slow-moving theater curtain. The first signs of dawn were subtle, not the dramatic sunrise that might grace an open landscape, but the gradual lightening that comes to city streets filtered through countless particles of moisture and the accumulated breath of a sleeping metropolis. The gaslight from the street lamp began to fade in significance as natural light slowly took precedence, though the transition was so gradual as to be barely perceptible to any single observer. Mrs. Harvey was the first to sense something amiss in the rhythm of Miller's Court. She had lived in close quarters with neighbors for decades and had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the normal patterns of morning activity. Usually, by this hour, she would have heard the soft sounds of Mary stirring, the creak of bed springs, the gentle movement of feet across the floor, the familiar ritual of morning preparation that had become as predictable as sunrise itself. But this morning brought only silence from the small room next door, a silence that felt different from the peaceful quiet of deep sleep. Mrs. Harvey lay in her own bed for several minutes, listening with the careful attention of someone who understood that small deviations from routine could sometimes signal larger problems. The absence of familiar sounds created a hollow space in the morning symphony that felt increasingly wrong with each passing moment. When Mrs. Harvey finally rose and moved to her small window, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the courtyard below with reasonable clarity. She could see that Mary's door remained closed, which was not unusual in itself, but combined with the continuing silence, it created a pattern that triggered her protective instincts. Mary was always an early riser, someone who greeted the day with the same careful attention she brought to all aspects of her life. The discovery came not with drama, but with the quiet certainty that accompanies the recognition of tragedy. When Mrs. Harvey knocked gently on Mary's door and received no response when she tried the handle and found it unlocked, when she stepped into the small room that had been made so beautiful through careful attention and loving care, the reality of what had occurred settled over her like a weight that seemed to press the very air from her lungs. But even in that first moment of recognition, Mrs. Harvey's response was shaped by the deep humanity that had characterized her relationship with Mary. Her first thought was not of sensation or horror, but of profound sadness. for a young life ended too soon for dreams that would never be fulfilled for the absence that would now exist in their small community. She understood immediately that this moment would change everything, not just for those who had known Mary personally, but for the way their neighborhood would be perceived and remembered. Mrs. Harvey's actions in those first crucial minutes were guided by her instinct to protect Mary's dignity even in death. She carefully arranged things so that when others arrived, and she knew they would arrive soon, they would find a scene that preserved some measure of the privacy and respect that Mary had valued in life. It was a small gesture in the face of enormous tragedy, but it spoke to the kind of community that existed in Miller's Court, where people looked out for each other even in the most difficult circumstances. The fog seemed to pause in its retreat, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of what had occurred. The gray air continued to soften the harsh edges of the morning light, creating an atmosphere that felt appropriate for tragedy, neither bright enough to seem indifferent, nor dark enough to feel ominous, but simply muted and respectful, as if the world itself was observing a moment of silence. When Mrs. Harvey finally stepped back into the courtyard to summon help, her movements were measured and deliberate. She understood that the next few hours would bring chaos to their quiet neighborhood that reporters and officials and curious onlookers would transform Miller's Court into something entirely different from the close-knit community it had been. But for now, in these last moments before the outside world intruded, she moved with the quiet dignity of someone performing a final act of neighborly care. The news spread through the neighborhood with the particular speed that tragic information always seems to possess, moving from person to person, not through deliberate gossip, but through the natural networks of concern and care that connected the residents of Whitechapel. Each person who learned of Mary's death processed the information through their own relationship with her, their own understanding of who she had been and what her presence had meant to their small community. Joseph learned of the tragedy from a co-worker at Billingsgate Market who had heard it from his landlady who had learned it from a shopkeeper on Commercial Street. The news hit him with the force of a physical blow, not just because of his personal connection to Mary, but because of the timing less than 12 hours after he had sat with her in the warm circle of lamplight sharing food and conversation, and the comfortable intimacy of people who had once meant everything to each other. His first reaction was disbelief, the mind's natural protection against information too devastating to process immediately. But as the reality settled over him, Joseph found himself thinking not about the tragedy itself, but about the evening they had shared about Mary's laugh, when he told stories from the fish market about the careful way she had prepared their simple meal, about the grace and dignity she had maintained, even while discussing the difficulties that had driven them apart. The women who had welcomed Mary into their weekly gatherings received the news with the particular grief that comes from losing someone who had brought light into their lives. They remembered her gentle humor, her skilled needlework, her ability to listen with genuine attention and offer comfort without judgment. Each of them felt the loss not just as the death of a neighbor, but as the elimination of a particular kind of presence that could not be replaced. Mrs. Brennan, the shopkeeper who had become an unofficial lighthouse for the neighborhood, found herself thinking about all the small interactions she had shared with Mary over the months. The careful way Mary counted her change, her unfailing politeness even when money was tight, the genuine warmth of her greetings on foggy mornings when recognition came through voice rather than sight. These small memories took on new weight and significance, becoming precious evidence of a life that had been lived with attention to the details that made human interaction meaningful. As word spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, the story began to transform in ways that would have grieved those who had known Mary personally. The newspapers that had already sensationalized the fear-gripping Whitechapel seized upon this latest tragedy as confirmation of their most dramatic headlines, transforming a complex human being into a symbol that served their need for shocking content rather than their obligation to truthful reporting. But in Miller's Court and the immediately surrounding streets, a different kind of story was being preserved, one that honored Mary's memory by remembering her as she had actually lived, rather than how she had died. Neighbors shared memories of her kindness, her dignity, her ability to find beauty in difficult circumstances. They talked about her careful attention to her small room, her generous spirit despite limited resources, her participation in the informal networks of mutual support that made survival possible in their challenging environment. The fog that had played such a prominent role in Mary's last evening began to dissipate more rapidly as the morning progressed, as if its work was finished, and it could now withdraw to allow the harsh light of day to illuminate what had occurred. But even as visibility improved and the familiar geography of the neighborhood reasserted itself, the sense of transformation remained. Miller's Court would never again be quite the same place it had been when Mary Kelly had been one of its residents. Mrs. Harvey found herself becoming an unofficial guardian of Mary's memory, fielding questions from officials and journalists with the careful discretion of someone who understood that the truth of a person's life was more complex and more precious than any headline could capture. She spoke about Mary's kindness, her dignity, her efforts to create beauty and meaning within difficult circumstances, painting a portrait of someone who had been much more than a victim, who had been a fully realized human being with hopes, fears, relationships, and dreams. The community's response to the tragedy revealed both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. People drew together for mutual comfort and protection, but they also became aware of how their neighborhood would now be perceived by the outside world, how this event would overshadow all the ordinary acts of kindness and dignity that characterized their daily lives. As the fog lifted completely and full daylight revealed the transformed landscape of Miller's Court, the residents found themselves navigating a strange new reality where their private grief had become public spectacle. The narrow streets that had been their home, their community, their place of safety and familiar routine were now filled with strangers who saw only the setting for a crime rather than the complex social network that had sustained people through countless ordinary days and nights. But even amid this invasion of privacy and the distortion of their reality, the people who had known Mary personally maintained their commitment to remembering her as she had actually lived. They shared stories among themselves that preserved the truth of her character, her laugh, her wisdom, her skill with needle and thread, her ability to find moments of genuine happiness, despite the challenges that surrounded her. Joseph found himself drawn back to Miller's Court despite the chaos and crowds needing to be near the place where he had last seen Mary, alive and well. He stood in the fog-cleared courtyard, remembering not the tragedy that had occurred, but the hundreds of ordinary evenings when he had climbed these same stairs to share simple meals and comfortable conversation with someone who had understood him in ways that no one else had. The women from Mary's needlework circle gathered informally throughout the day, finding comfort in each other's company and in the shared task of remembering their friend accurately. They talked about her skill as a seamstress, her gentle humor, her ability to offer practical advice without ever seeming to judge the circumstances that made such advice necessary. These conversations became a form of protection against the sensational accounts that were already beginning to appear in the newspapers. Mrs. Harvey took on the role of unofficial spokesperson for those who had known Mary well, speaking to officials and reporters with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word would be weighed and potentially distorted. She emphasized Mary's humanity, her dignity, her participation in the life of their community as a valued neighbor and friend. The fog's complete retreat revealed a world that looked familiar, but felt fundamentally changed. The same buildings stood in the same places, the same streets connected the same destinations, but the atmosphere had been altered in ways that would take time to understand fully. The residents of Miller's Court and the surrounding area would need to rebuild their sense of safety and community, while also preserving the memory of someone who had been an important part of what they were rebuilding. In the midst of all the chaos and grief, small acts of remembrance began to emerge organically from the community. Someone left flowers outside Mary's door. Mrs. Harvey carefully preserved some of Mary's personal belongings, understanding that they represented not just material objects, but evidence of a life lived with care and attention. The women from the needlework circle talked about continuing to meet partly for their own comfort, but also as a way of honoring Mary's memory by maintaining something she had valued. The transformation of Miller's Court from private community to public symbol would continue in the days and weeks to come. But on this first day and these first hours after the discovery, the people who had known Mary Kelly personally were focused on a simpler and more important task, remembering her as she had been preserving the truth of her life against the distortions that would inevitably follow, and finding ways to honor her memory that reflected the dignity and grace she had brought to her daily existence. As the morning progressed, and the full implications of what had occurred began to settle over the neighborhood, the residents of Miller's Court faced the challenge of maintaining their humanity and their community in the face of tragedy and unwanted attention. They would need to find ways to grieve for their friend, while also protecting themselves from the sensationalism that threatened to overwhelm the truth of who Mary Kelly had been and what her life had meant to those who had known her. And so, we reach the end of our gentle journey through Mary Kelly's final day, though in truth, it is not really an ending at all. Stories like Mary's don't conclude with the last breath or the final page. They continue in the memories of those who knew her in the small acts of kindness she inspired and the dignity she maintained that showed others how to live with grace despite difficult circumstances. As you rest now in your own comfortable bed, perhaps with fog pressing softly against your own windows, let yourself hold space for the Mary Kelly who existed beyond the headlines, the young woman who made tea with ceremony each morning, who created beauty in a small room through careful attention and loving care, who maintained friendships that enriched her life and the lives of others who found moments of genuine happiness, even in circumstances that were far from ideal. The fog that played such a prominent role in Mary's last evening has lifted now, both literally and metaphorically, revealing a world that continues to turn despite tragedy, where ordinary people still rise each morning to tend their small fires, prepare their simple meals, and care for one another with the persistent kindness that makes life bearable and sometimes beautiful. The same basic human activities that filled Mary's days, the sharing of food, the comfort of conversation, the creation of order and beauty in small spaces, continue in countless homes and communities, creating the ongoing tapestry of human experience that connects us all across time and circumstance. Mrs. Harvey continued to live in Miller's Court for many years after that November morning, carrying Mary's memory forward through the simple act of continuing to be the kind of neighbor Mary had valued, watchful, but not intrusive, helpful, but not patronizing, present in the way that true community requires. The women from the needlework circle kept meeting, sometimes talking about Mary, sometimes simply sitting together in the companionable silence she had appreciated their continued gathering, a living memorial to the friendship she had brought into their lives. Joseph carried the memory of their last evening together for the rest of his life, not as a burden of guilt or regret, but as a treasured reminder of what had been beautiful between them. In later years, when people asked him about Mary Kelly, he would speak not about the tragedy that ended her life, but about her laugh, her skill with ordinary tasks, her ability to make a simple meal feel like a celebration through the attention and care she brought to its preparation. The mystery of what happened in those final hours remains unsolved, perhaps mercifully so. Some questions are less important than the understanding we can gain from the life that preceded them. Mary Kelly's story is not really about how she died, but about how she lived with dignity, with attention to beauty, with care for others, with the quiet courage that allows people to maintain their humanity in the face of circumstances that might otherwise overwhelm the spirit. As you drift towards sleep, now let yourself be comforted by the knowledge that Mary's life, however brief, was filled with genuine moments of connection, happiness, and peace. She experienced the warmth of friendship, the satisfaction of work well, done the simple pleasure of a cup of tea on a foggy morning, the deep comfort of being cared for and of caring for others in return. These experiences multiplied across thousands of ordinary days, created a life that was meaningful and valuable regardless of how it ended. The fog that surrounded her final evening continues to move through the world, softening harsh edges, creating moments of mystery and beauty, reminding us that the familiar can become magical when seen through eyes that appreciate wonder. Let it carry you now into peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that you too are part of the great human story of ordinary people finding ways to live with grace, to care for one another, and to create beauty and meaning in whatever circumstances they find themselves. Rest well, and remember that every act of kindness, every moment of genuine connection, every effort to create beauty in your own small corner of the world connects you to Mary Kelly and to all the countless others who have understood that a life well lived is measured not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated weight of daily choices to meet each morning with hope, each challenge with dignity, and each opportunity for human connection with an open heart. Sleep peacefully, now wrapped in the same gentle fog that embraced Mary's last evening, knowing that her story continues in every act of care, every moment of beauty noticed and appreciated, every choice to treat others and yourself with the kindness that makes life not just bearable, but precious. The mystery remains, but the meaning is clear. A life lived with attention, care, and love for others is never truly lost, but continues to ripple outward through time, touching lives and inspiring kindness in ways that can never be fully measured or completely understood. Rest now in that knowledge and let your dreams be gentle and filled with the same peace that Mary found in her small room on that foggy November evening so long ago. And with those soft thoughts, we close our gentle exploration of Mary Kelly's final day. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through history. Until we meet again in the quiet hours of night, when stories help us find our way to restful sleep. Sweet dreams.